I'm 64 also, and I weigh more than you.
That's something that came out of my mouth. That's hard to tell you.
No, I the number of times I've been told to shut up. It's just walking out by yourself. Down the street in Barber, on my phone, where I still live in American sweatshirt, American Eagle, blue, no like new women on it. Just like, oh, just shy. Some like random. Some random kid.
There's a five right next door. I'm so happy.
You should have sent to no, actually, I should have a bar party.
So like it's right next to outside. So there's like all these food restaurants that like yeah. So I'm pretty happy. If anything, needs to happen in our area. So everything is all about.
Right. So I mean, I
Oh, right, you guys are
all the way down Empire by Renton.
That's one of my old schools.
I know the syndrome.
I mean, I was told by a bunch of
It's really scary. My major here at my old school was that I couldn't see anyone to other teachers. Like they would just like go after a teacher, and then at the end of the year they like went after teachers. Like it was after I had already said like so I knew it was like mostly okay because like this other school had already said they were going to hire me, but they hadn't sent the paperwork.
Do you know the really cranite diagram?
But I think they did it because I said
diagram?
I don't know.
His name's brother-in-law. He, his family's cousin. They can come and then like he came from out.
Oh, you ready?
Right, they don't even reason and there's really so it's scary. So that's you. I was like, that's what I was
Yiddish, huh?
like.
I was married to the Skype for
There you go. Yeah, that would be.
Okay.
Yes.
One more thing. Sorry. Okay. I think that we are ready.
I wanted to know, but
Okay.
It's still being at 8.
Okay. We are ready.
Get out there.
So I'll give you an introduction. Diagram, place of summer.
Okay, everybody. Long last. Sorry for the technical issues with the live broadcast. So much for coming. Just food at any time. Make yourself comfortable. This is recorded live, but only Pesach is going to be able to be seen, and hopefully he's being heard. I hope everyone here can hear, right, with this mic. First time we're using it, so I hope it works.
All right.
So anyway, Pesach, you want to give a little introduction about yourself first?
Sure. Pesach Somer. I live in Passaic, New Jersey. Guess I'm a chinuch. I'm married, 8 children, and this is my second time being involved with a Project Makam event, and very excited to be here. I want to thank our host for opening up this incredible library for us. It's a real pleasure to be here. It's supposed to be here, and thank you very, very much. So I think the topic name, I don't remember what I was supposed to speak about. I think the topic name was something about reading Torah rationally. I think is that the name. So I thought that was like that's a pretty broad topic, and I figured, I didn't have weeks to speak, so I figured what I would do is I would take one particular topic and try to approach it from kind of a rational approach, and hopefully from this we can kind of get an idea of what I think maybe could be meant when we talk about reading Torah rationally. Just the introduction, I'll tell you the topic, but then I'm going to kind of have a little bit of an introduction before I really get into it. I'm going to be speaking about the topic of the Nachash in Gan Eden, right? We all know the basic story, Adam and Chava. The Nachash comes and speaks to Chava and everything that happens afterwards. And the question that I want to ask, and again, obviously, I'm going to be sharing my ideas, but everything is going to be from Meforshim. I'm not, any ideas that sound maybe a little bit, extreme or things that maybe we wouldn't expect to hear. This is all from classical Meforshim as well as some modern Meforshim. But the question I want to ask is when we talk about the Nachash, are we expected to believe that there was a walking, talking Nachash that could communicate with Chava? That's the topic that I'm going to approach. And again, we're going to approach it from a rational standpoint. In other words, I'll explain a little bit more shortly. Before I do, just a little bit of a background. About 18 years ago, I was learning in a kollel in Eretz Yisrael. I was in a kollel, Esha Torah kollel. It was mainly Bali Tshuva. I was there. There was a particular shir I wanted to be in, so I was there in that shir. And I had this chavrusa. I'll call him Rafi because that was his name. And Rafi was brilliant. Rafi, I don't remember. I'm an American, so I don't know. But he was from England. He either studied in Oxford or Cambridge, whichever one. He was a very, very bright guy.
I know that guy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Did?
Yeah.
Okay. And Rafi, very, very, very bright guy. And but he was about Tshuva, as were most of the guys at Esha Torah. And I remember he had a brother who was also apparently a very, very bright guy. And his brother was very upset, as happens with many families of Bali Tshuva. His brother was very upset that he had become a Bali Tshuva. And he wanted to try to save him. So we used to send him these letters. I'm not exaggerating, 10 to 15 page letters trying to prove to him that certain things in Torah weren't true. And he would get these letters from time to time. He would mention them to me. I would laugh, how could there be any, real good questions on Torah? That's ridiculous, And one day, and I'm not going to get into the topic. I believe in answering all questions. I don't believe in introducing questions. But one day, I just for the heck of it, I thought it would be funny. I thought, can I see one of those letters? I figured, it'd be good for a laugh. This guy has these questions. Everybody knows there's no really good questions. And I read it. destroy my family's, shalom over whatever issues I was going through. It's just like I could believe again I was going to have to fake it for the rest of my life. I just wasn't going to do that to my family. I still remember. I mean, I thought I was keeping it a secret from my wife, and one day she said to me, she'd figured it out, and it was very, very, very painful. And again, I had to. I really had to work very, very hard on it. I really had to. I started again reading as much as I could. I started speaking to anyone I could. Rosh Yeshiva. I mean, anyone and everything. Just trying desperately to do it. And again, it took me a while to go through it. It was an uncomfortable time. But again, in the end, Baruch Hashem, I reached a point where I was able to come up with an approach that worked for me. And I remember one of the people I spoke to. I know Yoel knows him. Rabbi Jeremy Weider. He's one of the Rosh Yeshiva University. We became friends at the time. Couldn't tell it by looking at me now, but at the time I was a marathon runner, and Rabbi Weider runs also. And we used to go for these runs on Friday morning, and I would just fire questions at him for 2 hours. I used to, there's a running book called Born to Run. I used to call this Born to Run. We would just go and, and just for 2 hours, I would just ask him all sorts of questions. I remember he told me something that was very, very helpful. And I think this is really something, this has really stayed with me. This is already 3 years later, I think. He said to me, he said, you have to go through and think about whether everything you think that you must believe, that it's forbidden to believe anything else, whether that's really true. He said, you literally have to go through anything you're not sure about and figure out, okay, let's say I can't believe X. Is that an essential belief? In other words, if I don't believe X, does that mean I'm no longer a Mammon? And the interesting thing was, again, is that there were many fewer things on that list than we're led to believe. In other words, we're led to believe a lot of times that there's all sorts of questions, there's all sorts of beliefs. If you don't believe X, that X is the Jewish view, that is the the Jewish people were, certainly the Jewish people that we know from the times of the second Beis Hamikdash and on, for many hundreds of years, were not really affected by secular philosophy, by Greek philosophy. The Jews of Alexandria were, but ultimately that community, whatever happened with that community, happened with that community. But certainly when we talk about the Tanaim and the Amoraim that we know about, the rabbis of the Mishnah and the Gemara and the Jews of that time, almost with no exception, they had very, very little interaction with Greek philosophy. I've looked into this recently. Again, try to find out, was there any, literally almost nothing. For many hundreds of years, there was no such thing as Jewish philosophy. In other words, there was Torah, there was the Gemara, there were Midrashim, there were all sorts of ideas put forth, but there was nothing like, in terms of what the Greeks had, in terms of a particular person teaching an idea, saying this is the Jewish view of, trying to formulate ideas and saying this is what we believe, etc. When that started to change is when the Jews started living among the Muslims, right? As much as maybe sometimes today this might be a little bit, hard, for us, maybe can't picture the Muslim world being like this. But if we go back 12 or 1300 years ago, the Muslim world was a very, very scholarly one, and was very much, they were the ones who sort of helped to spread the ideas of Greek philosophy. And Rav Saadia Gaon, who was, as you can tell by the title of his name, was one of the Gaonim. He lived around the late 900s, from the I think 892 around, somewhere around there. I don't know if that's when he died, when he was born, but around, so about, so we're talking about 1,100 years ago, a little bit more than 1,100 years ago. He was really probably the first one to try to come up, he's living among the Muslims. They're into these ideas of philosophy. And as often happens with the Jewish people, when we live among people who start to be into all sorts of things, we're affected by it. Sometimes we're affected positively, and sometimes we're affected negatively, but we're always affected by our surroundings. It's never a coincidence. If you look what's going on in the secular world in terms of knowledge, it always filters into the Jewish world one way or another. And so Rav Saadia Gaon was the first one pretty much to write a book of Jewish philosophy, to try to spell out what Jews believe. And at the beginning of the seventh Ma'amar, he says as follows. He's talking about Tchias HaMesim, which we're not going to get into right now. And he says, Shekol davar shenimtza b'mikra, anything that's found in Tanakh, harehu k'pshuto, you should take it literally, simply read it like it's, again, whatever pshat means, that's maybe a little bit of a loaded term, but you read the story as is. And he says, except there are 4 exceptions. There are 4 times when you read something in the Torah when you're allowed to not read it literally. And he goes through, we're not going to go through all of them, but one of the 4 things he says, and the Rambam echoes this a few hundred years later, is things that go across, let me see if I can find the specific words. He says, one of 4 reasons, either because just our senses show that it's not true, or if our mind showed that it's not true. The Rambam, formulated a little bit differently, but essentially what Rav Saadia Gaon was saying, and the Rambam agreed with, is that if there's something that it says in the Torah and it goes against, I'm going to use a term, it's not exactly what they're saying, but it's basically what they're saying. If it goes against proven science, then you have to reread the Torah. In other words, Rav Saadia Gaon believed, and the Rambam said the same thing, that when it comes that there's one creator of the world, and he's the same one who gave the Torah. And what we call science, and again, proven science, and there's a very big difference. I'm not talking about what's a theory. And again, there could be something that can be believed within the scientific community for hundreds of years, and then it changes. So we can argue about, what exactly is meant by proven science, but something which is objectively shown to be factual. He says, if that's the case, if the Torah seems to go against that, he says it's impossible, because God created the world, and true science is God's world. And therefore, if you read something in the Torah that seems to go against true science, then it means you're misreading the Torah. And we have an obligation then to figure out what the Torah must mean, but it can't mean what it seems to mean, because there cannot be a conflict between true science and Torah. And again, not like, sometimes people say that today, they'll say, well, if science argues with the Torah, well, science obviously must be wrong. He's saying the exact opposite. He's saying true science is a fact, the Torah wouldn't argue with facts, and therefore, if you're reading it that way, we have to change it. And the Rambam was almost willing to, to say that the world had actually, that physical matter had always existed based on this. I mean, because Aristotle argued it did, without getting into all of that. But again, Rav Sadion gives us this very, very important principle that, again, we're not obligated to shut off our brain. We're not obligated to pretend that the world operates in ways, that it doesn't. And therefore, again, if there's something that's factually not the case, then we change the way we read the Torah. So with that introduction, right, if we all know the basic story. If we open up Bereshis to the beginning of Perek Gimel, right, we know Adam and Chava have been created. They're in the Gan. They're in the garden. And it starts talking about this Nachash. And Nachash haya aru mikol chayas hasadeh. The Nachash was the most wise or cunning of all the animals, the wild animals of the field, which God had created. Vayomer el ha'isha. And he said to the woman, right, again, which a simple reading of the pasuk seems to suggest that there was a snake who could speak to human beings. And he gets into a whole conversation with her, and he asks her about the tree. And she answers what she does, and he tries to convince her. And in the end, he does, and she takes from the fruit of the tree, and she gives to her husband, and she eats it, and then everything falls apart, and ultimately they're kicked out of the Gan. So it's a very, very, perplexing story. If I asked you again, based on what you know, was there a walking, talking Nachash? In other words, anything you know from the story, anything just from your own experience, I mean, any thoughts? Was the snake that we're talking about in the Torah, was it a literal, a snake that could seemingly, walk, and certainly it's expressed very clearly that it could talk? Are we, is that the case?
Well, we know that it was different before it was cursed, so it was walking.
Okay. So one of the things that we have to take into consideration, right, is that after this whole mess goes down, God kind of confronts all of them. He gives a curse to all of them, right? And right away it says in Pasuk Yudalad, Vayomer Elokim el Nachash. It sounds like God is speaking to a snake, which again, if the snake doesn't speak, it's odd. And he's about to punish the snake. Ki asita zos, right? Arur ata mikol habeima mikol chaya hasadeh. You're cursed from all the animals. Al gachoncha telech. You will crawl on your stomach, right? Which is mashma that. Up until this moment, it was not crawling on its stomach. Right? Afar tochal, which again seems to suggest whatever it's going to eat now, whether literally dust or not, it was not doing that before. Kol yemei chayecha, and there's going to be this bad relationship between you and man, and they're going to try to kill you, and you're going to try to bite it. Right? So if you read that, the punishment certainly seems to suggest that it was a walking, talking snake. And in fact, this is the approach of the Ibn Ezra. Right? The Ibn Ezra, interestingly, the Ibn Ezra. Who lived in Spain, and he was a big rationalist, right? So if you're going to expect anyone to start kind of chipping away at the idea of a walking, talking snake, you would think maybe it would be the Ibn Ezra. The Ibn Ezra is someone who certainly does not shy away from controversy. Certain things he says openly, certain things he hints at, but he certainly was no stranger to being willing to say things that you wouldn't necessarily say if you were saying a Dvar Torah at your Shabbos table. But the Ibn Ezra is actually getting old over here. The Ibn Ezra actually says, let me see, a little hard for me to read this over here, small print, but let me see. He says, Yesh amar ki ha'isha hayta mevina v'yodea lashon hachayot. So first, by the way, I apologize. On Wednesday nights, I usually give a shout out to my former students who were Syrian, so I'm used to speaking Sfaradit. So if I switch back and forth, you don't have to worry. I'm a good old Ashkenazi boy, but if I switch back and forth, it's just I've gotten used to speaking in Sfaradit on Wednesday nights. But he says, before he goes into his own explanations, he says, some say that how are they able to communicate? It's not that the snake could speak with people, but that Chava knew how to speak animal language. Okay, for sure.
They named all the animals, didn't they?
Oh, I'm sorry.
They named them.
Right, they named the animals. Right, yeah.
And they also was known to know the language.
Maybe. Right, so that's what Ibn Ezra says. He says maybe. He says Vayomer hanachash biramizah va'acherim amru shehu satan. We'll see what this is. Some say that it was the Satan or Yetzer Hara. Ech lo yiru sofa parsha. And he says, but how could they say this? He said, didn't they see the end of the parsha? Right at the end of the parsha, what does it say? it talks about these punishments. It makes it very, very clear, right? Right? I mean, what if you're going to say it was the Satan? Then what does that mean? God cursed the Satan and made it the Satan walk on its belly. The Eich Yochal Afar and Umatam Kilos who. And why do you curse the Satan? He says, it clearly says anyone who wants to say anything other than this was a walking, talking snake, it can't be. They haven't read the Pasuk. And he says, Rabim Hishtab Shulach Kor, and many made the mistake of investigating this. And he says it can't be. Right? So in other words, the Ibn Ezra says, probably, if you ask the average person what you're supposed to believe, the Ibn Ezra says it. He says that we believe there was a walking, talking snake. It used to talk, used to walk. It did something wrong. It sinned, and therefore was punished. Problem is, if you look into it, it's not so simple. Because again, if it was a walking, talking snake, and then it's punished, right? What was the punishment that we just said? What happens to it? What does the actual punishment say?
It crawls on his belly.
It crawls,
It step on his head.
right, and it steps on the head, and it eats dirt. What does it not say?
It loses the speech.
It doesn't lose the ability to speak, right? It's rather odd, right? In other words, if you're going to say that it's that it used to speak and then it no longer can speak, you would think that should have been one of the punishments. So, which is what brings us to some of the other Meforshim, the Sforno, Rav Ovadia Sforno, as well as the Ralbag. The Ralbag, Rav Levi ben Gershon, they were both, again, these extreme rationalists. The Ralbag was really, he makes like the Rambam look like a chassid. I mean, the Ralbag was like, he was super duper, like as much as the Rambam was into Greek philosophy, the Ralbag 10 times that. The Ralbag like was very, very, very just completely into rationality. And as we might expect from someone who had such an approach, the Ralbag, as well as the Sforno, they come along and they say, no, we're not talking about a walking, talking snake. And as we mentioned beforehand, the Ibn Ezra didn't say it in his name because I think the Ibn Ezra lived earlier, but he says, like the Ibn Ezra said, Hu hasatan, hu yetzer hara. When we talk about the snake in the story, the snake, there is no walking, talking snake. That whatever it is that happened with Chava is the yetzer hara. Right, and he actually proves it. He actually says there are some of these midrashim that exist. Right, and he says just like you talk about a king, you say he's like a lion. So again, why is it using the snake? It's not because there actually was a snake, but it was the yetzer hara. She was being, like again, anytime we're tempted to do an avera, it tries to convince us to do things we shouldn't. And it was essentially she was just being tempted by what was going on. And he says, and he actually says, in fact, there's a medrash that says that Samael was riding on the snake and whatever it is, and he says, what does that really mean? He says again, it was the yetzer hara. She was being tempted to do an avera, and again, the Ralbag, I didn't bring the Ralbag, but says something very, very similar. So all of a sudden here, for the first time, we start to see the possibility. We have, two Rishonim, one of whom even made it into Mikros Gedolos, two Rishonim who are willing to say that no, there was no walking, talking snake. It was the yetzer hara. It was a battle. The Torah is telling us about this battle with her yetzer hara that occurred. And of course, if that's the case, then what do we have to explain according to the Sforno and the Ralbag? What's going to be a problem for them? What do I mean the punishment, right? I mean, in other words, what does that mean? Yeah. How do you, why is the yetzer hara punished? So it's here, and this is a little bit, it's a little bit of a weakness for the Sforno, there's no question about it. But he suggests that there is sort of like that whatever it is, whatever it's saying the curse is, and we're not going to read it inside, but whatever it's saying the curse is that it really, the yetzer hara of a person changed after this. In other words, there were physical curses that happened to Adam and Chava, things that changed for men and women, and somehow whatever the yetzer hara was beforehand, its essence now changed. The yetzer hara became different. In other words, that's what it means that the Nachash was cursed. There was no Nachash. There was no walking, talking Nachash. It was the yetzer hara. The Nachash is just code for that. And the punishment just means that somehow the yetzer hara changed. Okay, which again, whatever you want to do with that, whatever you want to do with that approach. Finally, in terms of the Rishonim, we come to the Abarbanel. Right, the Abarbanel, Rav Dan Yitzchak Abarbanel, he was right at the end of the time period of the Rishonim. He lived in Spain at the time of the Inquisition. He was actually, he was an advisor to the king and queen, and he tried to save the Jews from being expelled themselves, he could have been saved. And rather than take the offer to stay, he actually went into exile himself. He went to Galus himself. He ended up going to Portugal. And I mean, he actually talks about in various places when he's writing, I mean, he's actually writing his Perush while all this is going on. I mean, I think it's finished around the year 1510 or so. So he's actually writing his Perush then. And it's a very, it's a really, really long Perush. And he has this feature. I mean, they tell this story, this boy who says, when I learn Chumash, I'm left with questions. I can't figure it out. And he says, well, what's your first experience? He says, I started learning the Abarbanel and I fell asleep at the beginning. So the Abarbanel is known. The Abarbanel, every section he goes and he asks all these questions. And then he goes through the entire parish and he basically spells it out. And he shows how, if you read the Psukim carefully, they answer his questions. And the questions are often very, very interesting as well. And he goes through these various approaches. He talks about why he doesn't like the other approaches. And he mentions something which we're going to actually touch on a little bit later. He actually mentions the Rambam. And the Rambam certainly says about the beginning of Bereshis, and not so clear how far he goes on this, that the beginning of Sefer Bereshis, meaning, the creation, is not necessarily literal. And again, we're not going to get into in terms of the Rambam specifically, but the Rambam holds out for the first time, and some of the Rishonim went crazy on this, and certainly on the followers of the of the Rambam, that people started to read the Torah as being not necessarily literal on certain stories, and became very, very contentious, a big, big fight. But he mentions the Rambam. The Abarbanel, who sometimes defends the Rambam, did not like this approach, and then he finally gives us his approach. 1 second. Lachen da'ati b'inyan hanachash v'tochen hasipur hu agid lecha po shehu yesod haparsha hazos v'amisa v'hu shahanachash lo diber klal el ha'isha. Now, Abarbanel says there was a snake, but the Nachash never spoke to the woman, which is very strange, because what does it say right at the beginning of the story? The Nachash spoke to the woman. V'lo ha'isha ilav, and she didn't speak back to him, which again makes it very, very difficult. Ki lo ish dvarim. Right, the paraphrasing from elsewhere in Chumash, it says, snakes don't talk. And he says, you'll say to me, there are animals in the Torah that talk. Which animals in the Torah talk? Bilam's donkey. You say, so animals can't talk when they have. He says, but what does it say over there? It says God opened the mouth of the donkey. God caused the donkey to speak. It doesn't say it here. So there's no reason to think that the Nachash actually spoke. So he says, right, okay. Aval hanachash lo amar shapadach espiv. It doesn't say l'fish lo diber klal lo b'derach tava v'lo b'derach nes. Not naturally, not a miracle. Aval haya inyan shehira asad hanachash haya ole be'etz hadas. Right. This was going on in her imagination. She sees this nachash, and the nachash is climbing all over the etz hadas, and she starts to think to herself, well, that's weird. Right, and not only that, ochel mi perosav, pam achar pam, and right, what does she start to think to herself? He's eating from the tree that you're not allowed to eat from, and what's happening to him? Nothing. V'lo ayameis, v'lo nizuk b'davar. Vayishach hashva b'zev v'tikra ba'atzma ki ilu haysa medaberes im hanachash. Right, so he says it's all in her imagination. She sees it going on, and in her head, when she sees the Nachash eating from the tree, she's saying to herself, "Did God really say that I can't eat from the tree?" Right now, of course, if you want to get lumdish, right? I mean, God really, right? You could say, right? Who did God say couldn't eat from the tree? It was really just mankind. I mean, there's no isser on the snake. Snakes don't have mitzvahs. But again, the way the Abarbanel sets this up, this whole conversation is going on in our head as he sees this going on, and the whole dialogue is internal. There was a snake. There was, Adam and Chava. There was not actually. There was no.
Isn't that the same as the Yetzer Hara telling her?
Right. It is similar in that sense, right? I mean. Right, but in other words, I guess the only difference would be that the Yetzer Hara is it was sort of like an internal conversation based on nothing. In other words, the Sforno and the Ralbag, I think, would say there was no snake there at all. Right, in other words,
she saw the snake and imagined the conversation.
Right. Whereas, but the Abarbanel was saying there's a snake there, but it's just a regular snake, and the whole conversation goes on in her head.
So whom would the curse apply to?
So if that's the case, right? So then, right, the Abarbanel, and again, you're never going to find a question you could ask on the Abarbanel that he didn't. you think of himself, he says, so why is the snake punished? So he says, and he shows that this is the case. He says, right, I mean, and here we could connect this to Bilam also. I'm not going to read this inside, but you could say the same thing. You could say in terms of Bilam, right? I mean, what happens when afterwards, when after the donkey speaks and the malach, Bilam finally sees the malach, the donkey dies, right? And by same thing by Noach, I mean, the time of Noach, the animals die. They say why, and one of the answers that's given, and this is what the Barbanel basically says, is basically the animals are there for mankind, and if they're involved somehow in tripping them up, or if something bad happens because of them, right? When we know this is true by the animals of Amalek, this is true by other averos that I won't get into right now, that a person can commit in terms of animals, the Egyptians' animals. In other words, the animals are really secondary to people, and it's not that the snake really did anything bad, but to some degree, the people messed up involving you, and sorry, you get punished. That's the Abarbanel's approach.
It's problematic with Bilam's talking donkey. That's probably the most problematic.
What do you mean?
Because he didn't really. Okay, made him turn off the road, but he didn't really trip him up in any way. I mean, he saved him.
Right, but that's the thing. But I think it's not saying that they actually did anything wrong, right? Because I think that essentially animals are not able to do anything. They don't have any sort of bechira. Just saying, but an avera occurred through you, right? Like that's that they say that no one should be able to say this is an animal of Amalek, right? That the animals didn't do anything wrong, but it's going to somehow bring to mind Amalek. Where that people will be able to say, that's what they say by Bilam. They'll say like that's the donkey that made that guy look like an idiot. So it's sort of like he has to be out of the picture, not because he sinned, but because basically for the well-being of people. So that's the Abarbanel's approach. So that's in terms of the Rishonim, and it's again they all take for granted a fairly they all take for granted that there's something's going on in Gan Eden, that there's that Adam and Chava are there. That something's going on with the snake. It's a real snake. It's an imaginary snake. There's a real conversation. There's not a real conversation. Ad Khan in terms of the Rishonim. What I want to spend the rest of the time really looking at is what about the last 200 years? In other words, again, as I mentioned beforehand, whenever the Jewish people live, whatever people they're in, and so again, sometimes they're affected by by kind of non Orthodox is kind of a silly term to use for this, but but non-Orthodox like Jewish groups, like we could talk, the Tzedukim, or we could talk about all these different. It could be Reform, it could be different, all these different movements. They're affected by that, but they're also affected by the non-Jews. And in the 19th century, it really starts even earlier. You have the scientific revolution has come about, and people are starting to, not just in the world of Judaism, but certainly Christianity is also, religion in general is on the defensive, right? People are basically,
So my question is to you is, what was I think the Karaim were also struggling with this idea, because they were struggling probably with the same idea that the Torah can't be taken.
Right. Well, right. So that's actually right. When we talk about the Karaim, that's what was going on with Rav Sadigan. This Rav Sadigan, as much as he was, what he was writing was to answer the Muslims, and some was to answer the Karaim. And
which time period?
Again, same time period. Again, in the time of the Gaonim, essentially. into the time of the early Rishonim. But again, a lot of the Torah that we have, both in terms of Meforshim on Chumash, and in terms of pretty much anything in Jewish philosophy, is a reaction to something going on elsewhere. Yeah.
Rav Sadigan lived at the time of the crime.
Yeah. So again, I think he's born in 892 CE. So we're talking, so there's towards the end of the time period of the Gaonim.
But that was their heyday, the crime.
Yeah.
Right.
And I'm saying it goes into the time of the obviously, the Ibn Ezra very famously, like when he disagrees, sometimes when he disagrees with the rabbis, the Ibn Ezra is not so shy to say what he thinks about them. And with the Karaim, he's even less shy. He'll sometimes make very witty comments that these days people wouldn't say in polite debate, but in those days it was permitted. Yeah.
I have a similar question, just moving along, but this approach of if it doesn't fit with science, then it can't necessarily be read that way is problematic, because the splitting of the sea, of national revelation, a lot of things to our minds don't logically make sense, or can't, so I feel like that seems like a very dangerous.
It is. That's a good question, and it's a good question, and I think it's a very real question. And we're sort of stuck. In other words, that's we'll see. The rabbis, the three approaches I'm going to mention now, all deal with this. In other words, because basically that's what I'm saying. Like, you know, starting with around the 1700s or so, even a little bit earlier, so the scientific method starts coming out, and people start being able to, you know, prove things, experiments, and being able, you know, talking about what happened, and you know, I mean, you have, you know, Spinoza, you know, attacking, you know, Torah and saying, you know, that you know, I mean, God is nature. I mean, and just this is going on all over Europe, and this is basically, and again, and there are different approaches. I mean, you can basically take an approach and you can say, like, you know, stick your fingers in your ear and say, no, I do not hear you. We don't, you know, listen to anything you say. But the problem, you know, and again, some do take that approach, and maybe sometimes, I don't know if I'm going to say it's the best approach, but it's an approach. I mean, sometimes, you know, what are you supposed to say? They're asking really, really good questions, and if we let the questions get out, people's emunah are going to be, you know, the other approach is like, we've got to say something, like something's going on over here. And you know, again, you know, as you get into the, you know, into the 1800s, it's getting even stronger. And in various ways, there are various chachamim who decide, who in various ways, you know, take this on. And I just want to share three with you, two of whom, again, their answer is going to be sufficiently from that you could, you know, you could say it over, because I mean, they take the story literally. And then we'll finish with one approach, which again, I admit to you is going to be controversial, but I think that it's important at least to hear it, that at least you have someone who's willing to say something along these lines, which I think we'll deal with a little bit with your question. So, you know, one of the people who tried to kind of not take a, you know, closed approach was Rav Shimshon Hirsch. Rav Shimshon Hirsch lived in Germany in the 19th century. And again, and this is, you know, I mean, Darwin is what, right around 1854, it comes up with Theory of Evolution, somewhere around the late 1840s, 1850s. It might have gotten published later on, right? But around the middle of the century, he starts to write it, and it starts to get out. And again, and some of the approaches, this is Krira, and it can't be true, and it goes against Torah, and Torah says God created. And little by little, again, you start to have rabbis who say, people have questions, people are starting to lose their faith, we have to do something, right? I mean, one of them, you have, for example, I remember I used to, you know, be very into learning Mishnayos. I used to do 2 Mishnayos a day. There's a parish of called the Tiferes Yisrael, Rav Yisrael Lifshitz, and he was the first. He was really, and he lived right at this time. And you know, in his parish, I mean, it's wild. He talks about that when they found the woolly mammoth, you know, frozen somewhere in some, you know, I mean, and he talks about it, and he mentions Darwin. I mean, he says Darwin, you know, I mean, he talks about it, and he starts using Kabbalah, and he talks about the idea that God, you know, it says that God created worlds and destroyed worlds, and maybe that's what it means. And again, and I just remember, you know, I mean, whether we want to say his approach is the answer, but again, it was certainly the beginning of an approach that said, people are going to hear it, people are going to have these questions, and if you don't give them something, then they're going to think you have nothing to say. And so Hirsch, interestingly, and you know, I mean, my friend Shlomo Pill, who's a big expert in Hirsch, I am not. I mean, I spoke about with him a little bit. I mean, I hope if he ends up hearing this, he'll forgive me if I don't exactly say it as well as he would. I mean, Hirsch does take it seriously. He says that it's a literal story, and there was a nachash, etc. But he comes out with a whole moral lesson, some which I'll share with you, because I think it's actually a very, very powerful idea. But the essential approach of what Hirsch says with these things is that, yeah, you know, maybe I want to be careful. I don't want to, you know, put words into his mouth. But essentially, what he's saying is, yeah, it's true, but it doesn't really. It doesn't really matter. In other words, because, you know, if we look at Torah as history, if we think of it as like, you know, in other words, we check things out. You know, historically, did this happen, and when did it happen, and how does this? We miss the point of what Torah is. Torah is given by God as a lesson, it's supposed to teach us things. We're supposed to take things out of it. So even, you know, if to some degree, even if, you know, and again, and he doesn't actually take this approach, but even if there had been something which you had been able to show Hirsch that made it impossible to believe that something was literal, you would have said, who cares? It's no big deal. In other words, the purpose of the Torah is not to teach you history. The purpose of the Torah is to teach you ideas, right? And just like, you know, I mean, you know, what gives us the right to limit God and say that God can only teach us things by telling us literal stories, but God can't teach us things through mashalim? I mean, you know, I mean, in other words, as long as essentially it's recognized that the Torah comes from Hashem. I'm sorry? Right, exactly, right. I mean, Eov is clearly an example of that, right? I mean, the Chazal were willing to say, you know, lo hayav lo nivra, you know. So I mean, you know, I mean, again, he certainly did take it literally, but again, he would tell us that the question is just, the question makes no sense. I mean, essentially, who cares? In other words, like, yeah, it might be an interesting thing to talk about, and it might be interesting to look into it, but essentially, you're really asking the wrong question. The question is, what does God want to teach you, and whether God, is so. I'm sorry, yeah, this is Rav Shmuel Hirsch, and the idea that he says is actually very interesting. I want to share with you. It's actually very powerful. He says the animals are truly Elokim Yodea Tov Ra. They're like God knowing good and bad. They are endowed with an instinct, and this instinct, it sounds weird at first, but is the voice of God, the will of God as it applies to them. Whatever animals do is in accordance with their instinct. They can only act in accordance with their instinct, right? In other words, animals can't be anything other than animals, right? For animals, what animals do is in accordance with instinct is good, and act from which the instincts restrain them is not error. They can't do anything wrong because, again, all they're created to be is animals. They have only their own nature which call to them. Not so in the case of man. He is to opt out of the good. He is to opt for the good. He's supposed to choose the good and shun evil out of his own free will and sense of duty. In other words, unlike animals, which are made to be animals and they can't choose to do anything. Like I always say, when the lion or whatever it is that ate Bambi's mother, the deer was going to do that. Like there's no sitting there and saying, oh my God, Bambi's, but who's going to put Bambi to sleep tonight? They eat deer. That's what they do. There's no moral struggle, and they're not supposed to be any sort of moral struggle, right? So he says that even when he gives his physical nature its due, he must not do. But he says, but with people, it's not true. He says, even when it comes to giving their physical nature its due, he must do so not because of the allure of his senses, but out of a sense of duty. Even when he takes physical pleasure, he must act in moral freedom, right? And again, this is all written in German, but okay, right? So man must never be an animal. Therefore, he has within him divine forces besides physical drives. His physical nature must of necessity be opposed to the good and attracted to evil, right? In other words, unlike an animal whose physical nature automatically does what God wants, Rav Hirsch says that our body actually pulls us away from God. Only thus will he choose the good and shun evil, right? That's essentially the test. Not because of the urging of his senses, but in spite of it. In other words, many times what our body tells us to do is against what God wants us to do.
It's against really what's good for us.
Right, yeah. And in fact, right. Right, exactly. Right. Through the freedom of his divine nature, he is to fulfill his lofty divine calling. For this reason, the voice of God does not speak from within him, as Hirsch said about animals, but to him, telling him what is good and what is evil. God's voice meets resistance from man's physical nature as long as his nature remains independent and without guidance. God's voice that whispers within man, the innate conscience, whose messenger is the sense of shame, serves only to warn man in general terms, to do good and shun evil. Precisely which acts are good and which are evil, that it can only learn from God. In other words, unlike animals who whatever they do is inherently good and they can't do evil, man hears from, there's nothing inside of us which tells us what to do. We have to hear from God. The animal merely develops its physical nature to which its intelligence is completely subservient. Man, however, was not placed in paradise to satisfy his physical nature. He was placed in paradise to serve God. The individual nature of the animal is the basis for which it assesses everything, because the animal is created only for itself. Man, however, was created to glorify God and to build his world. And then he goes through this whole idea and he shows that this is really the struggle that's taking place. In other words, the whole struggle, which what we're being taught about over here, is the struggle of mankind, whether he's going to be like the snake. In other words, whether upon seeing the snake, he's going to think like, why can't I just follow my conscience like an animal does? Why can't I just follow my animal instincts? And this whole point is that, again, no, the animals, they're supposed to follow their animal instincts. We're supposed to overcome them. So again, Hirsch, again, he doesn't specifically get into it. It's fairly clear. I mean, I was discussing this with Shlomo Pill. I mean, just to make sure, it's fairly clear. I mean, he takes it literally, but again, to him, the literal side of it doesn't really matter. The thing that matters is that there's a major lesson that's supposed to be taught over here, and that's what we're supposed to be doing. And I think like even if somehow you could have proven to Hirsch that there could not have been a walking, talking snake, we say, okay, so God's speaking through a mashal. Because again, the point of the Torah is not it's not a history book, and that's why I think essentially when it if it conflicts, I think that's what Rasad means. If it's conflicting with science, okay, it's not a science book. It's a guidebook for life, and science does what science does, and God is talking about something else, and therefore, the idea of conflict makes no sense. The next book I don't own. It's actually, you can get it on what's it called, on Amazon. You can get anything in Amazon. But you have the Shadal, Shlomo David Luria, who again lives in the 19th century in Italy. was also, again, he was very into biblical scholarship. He responded to a lot was going on. And he actually has a very interesting idea. And again, at first I thought he was not taking the story literally, but he does. We're going to get to some. And I just wrote down some notes in terms of what he says. He says that sometimes he teaches also like a very interesting idea. He says, I mean, he points out it's very strange. If you think about what happened, right? I mean, essentially, especially within like the view of Chazal, God creates the world, puts them in Gan Eden, and within basically hours or whatever, a very short amount, everything goes down, they're kicked out and they're never allowed back there. It's like, it's very, very strange. Like if that's where they're supposed to be, like, I mean, it's pretty weird. I mean, like basically thousands of years, millions of years, billions of years, whatever you want to say, are not spent in Gan Eden. A few hours are spent in Gan Eden. Like what's going on over here? So the Shadal offers again. Right. I mean, right. And that's all right. Right, it's a very strange thing. I mean, the Rambam also, I mean, the Moreh Nevuchim talks about that. Like, how could it be? You know, I mean, the Rambam, some guy actually suggested the Rambam, the man was created without a Yetzer Hara, and he only gets it afterwards. And the Rambam rips into him and says that's impossible. Right, but I mean, it's very strange. I mean, again, like, how does this work out? I mean, this, you know, if this is really the place where man's supposed to be, why does it not work out? So Shadal says something very interesting. He says that sometimes, you know, we complain, we look at the world and we look at what happens to us and we just feel like, why do bad things happen to me? You know, why did my life go the way it does? And he says that really, he says, you know, what is the story teaching us? Hashem created us above all the animals, right? Even if it says that the Nachash was Arum Mikol Chayas Hasadeh, it was maybe the smartest of all animals, but man was above that. And we have this intellect, we have this gift, which puts us above the animals, sort of what Rav Hirsch just talked about. Our minds are what really make us unique, right? I mean, when we talk, you know, many of the Rishonim, when they talk about what does it mean to be created in the image of God, right? I mean, God doesn't have an image. They say it's talking about our intellect, our ability to think about things. And he says, and really says what happens is that a lot of what happens to us, a lot of times when we complain, we're really trying to say, like, why did you do that to me, God? But what's the real answer a lot of the time? Why did I do that to myself, right? So that really the intellect that we have is really the thing that all we're supposed to. And he says it's interesting. He says, but let's say we're given a choice. Okay, you know what? You don't want to have this challenge anymore. You don't want to have to struggle with this. You don't want to have to fight all these urges. I'll tell you what, I'll make you an animal. You know, we'll perform some sort of surgery on you. We'll, you know, trade your brain for brain of a chimpanzee. You'll still be able to type 37 words on a computer. You'll have opposable thumbs or whatever it is. Deal, you won't have to suffer anymore. Right? And he says clearly, like the Shadal says, clearly given that choice, what would we say? Despite the fact that being human comes with all this pain, no, we wouldn't give it up in a second. He says in fact, so he says very interestingly, he says this whole idea, this whole story, he says it's not, when it says it's a punishment, that man punishes, he says it's not really a punishment. He's saying that really what God is giving us, in other words, what happens in Gan Eden is that man really becomes who man is supposed to be. Right? The whole point of the story, right? He says that the snake was created. It was a one-time, he says this isn't the regular snake we're talking about. It was a one-time special snake that was just supposed to trip people up. But that basically the whole point of the story is we were not supposed to spend eternity in Gan Eden. We were supposed to mess up. We were supposed to realize, and we were supposed to, so to speak, make the wrong choice. And that we would recognize that we had brought about this challenge on ourselves and that this is what we would take. In other words, he really like flips the story on its head. It's not really, again, about, these people who messed up. And if they hadn't, we'd be living forever and all these things and we'd never die and we'd be what? He says, no, he says, the real purpose of man was to be who we are now, to be with these challenges that we have. But he says, but if God had created us straight like this, what would have people been able to say? Like, oh, it's not fair. Why didn't you give us a chance? So God gave us a chance, but it had to go wrong. But again, it's inherent. I mean, really, what he's saying is that whatever Adam and Chava were before what happened with Eitz Hadas, that was not the purpose of mankind. It wasn't supposed to last. It couldn't have lasted. God made it not last. The punishment is really who we're supposed to be. And he says, and the whole thing is, again, it's, different moral than Rav Hirsch. But again, the moral is just to recognize that essentially we brought this on ourselves. But we wouldn't want it any other way. Given a choice between being, these perfect creatures who, sit in the, he said literally, who, sit and eat grass in the field and whatever it is, right? I mean, a cow never, sits and has, religious crisis and whatever it is. no one would take that. I mean, again, it's easier, it's safer, but nobody would want that. And finally, which brings us now to Rav Kook. I always say, I mean, I always say when I talk about Rav Kook, right, Rav Kook was fairly hated in Yerushalayim by kind of like the old Yishuv. I mean, Rabbi Eliach, who should live and be well, who's the former principal of Yishuv Flapper. She told me that when he was a boy, this is I think in the early 1920s maybe. Actually, maybe probably late 20s, early 30s. He said that he was in this youth group where he used to go, and it was and one day his grandfather said, you're not going back to this youth group. He says, why? What happened? He said that day they had taken a boy, they put a strimel on his head. Because, that's the thing. I mean, sometimes you hear about Rav Kook and you would think he wore like a kippah ruga and whatever, sandals and jeans, but, beard and strimel. So they put a strimel on a boy's head. They had him sit in the middle of the circle, and they gave all the other kids fruit peels and garbage, and they threw him, and they said, that's Rav Kook, and they threw it at him. And his grandfather said, you're never going back. And believe it or not, who was the guy who ran the youth group? He was actually the one who founded Torah Karta. Okay, interesting historical. I'm not making this up. This is what Rabbi Eliach told me. He was never allowed to go back to this group. But I always say, I mean, Rav Kook was mostly hated for his position with the Zionists, right? I mean, and again, I mean, he's very, very complicated. I mean, I go to Chabur every week with, on where we learn sort of Kook's Torah, and I'm only beginning to even, just get into. But Rav Kook was a very, very complex thinker, and he was not the first, but he was one of the first religious people to basically not, say, to allow for the possibility that Zionism could be religious. Right? I mean, there were some there was Rav Kalisher, there was Rav Reines, there were some others, but essentially the general religious position in Europe was that Zionism, it was started by non-believers, and it was. I mean, it was, they talk about, some of the early kibbutzim where they used to have, they would have, barbecues on Yom Kippur. I mean, it was a very, very, and Rav Kook comes to Israel, I believe in the late 1800s, right before the turn of the century, and he started working with them, and he went around, and actually at the beginning he went around with the chief rabbi from the old yeshuv, and they would go around and they would speak to the different kibbutzniks, but essentially eventually his ideas, some of which were very, very controversial when it came to Zionism, got him in very, very big trouble. But I say, the truth is, if they had really read his philosophy, they would have hated him 10 times more. As much as he was controversial for being a Zionist, his philosophy, he really, he really was willing to deal with the challenges in a very real way. He wrote to his father-in-law, who was a big Gaon himself, and he basically said, he's living in this time. And again, that's saying, he learned in Volozhin, which was one of the great yeshivas, in any part of Jewish history. And in those days, again, in Volozhin and other yeshivas as well. I mean, if you were an intellectually minded Jewish male, you didn't really have many choices. I mean, most of the great universities of Europe would not take you. So the yeshivas in Eastern Europe, they had some they had some people who were not necessarily ma'aminim there, but they were just, they were bright, and they liked to think, and this is a place where you could go if you were a smart man, and you could go there, and they'd go there. So Rav Kook was in this world, and he saw what was going on. I mean, the maskilim, you had all these Jews who were very anti-religious, who were talking about all these intellectual ideas. He certainly knew about Darwinism. And he says to his father-in-law, he says, no one's doing anything. No, we have this massive problem that's going on. Jews are struggling with their emunah, and no one's doing anything. And he said, if you think about it, the Rambam, right? He wrote the Moreh Nevuchim, right? The Guide for the Perplexed, for Jews who were confused by the philosophy of their time. I mean, that's what he wrote. And again, whether he was successful, whether he wrote, whatever you want to say about the Moreh Nevuchim, but he said that the Rambam wrote the Moreh Nevuchim to help people who have these doubts, and he said, and someone needs to do it. And at a certain point, Rav Kook realized, b'makom she'ein ish, hishtadel lios ish. No one else was doing it, and Rav Kook decided to write a sefer. Ultimately, it's actually very interesting. In the back, there's actually the whole story of it. This sefer was not published until Rav Kook's. We're coming up to his 80th yahrzeit. He died in 1935. He had a son, Rav Tzvi Yehuda, the famous Merkaz Rav Yeshiva, who took over. Rav Tzvi Yehuda, in many ways, tried to protect his father from himself. Mm-hmm. And when he would publish his books, he would some of his books he wouldn't publish at all. Some of them he would publish and he would cut things out. There were certain things that his father said that he just felt like, yeah. And for whatever reason, and then the guy who actually put this book together actually talks about why it is. This book basically, they titled it Nevuchei Hador. Rav Kook never published it. He wasn't much of a publisher. He wasn't even much of a writer. He was very mystical. He was like a really creative thinker. I mean, he wasn't capable of writing books with, chapter 2 following chapter 1. He wrote what came to his head, and he wrote this book. The guy actually shows that he wrote this book about 120 years ago, and it was basically never published, and nobody ever saw it. And Rav Tzvi Yehuda knew about it and never let it see the light of day. And in the last, there's a scholar, a great, someone who's a Talmud Chacham and a scholar, Professor Yehuda Mirsky, who wrote about Rav Kook in 2008, 2009, and he said as far as he knew, this book didn't exist. So we're talking about literally, it's only become known in the last, 5+ years. But in here, Rav Kook basically tries to deal with these issues. I just want to read you a few parts. I know it's, the hour's a little bit late. And again, it has the advantage over Rav Kook's later books. Rav Kook's later books, he was very into writing in a literary way. The Jews at the time were very into literature, and he thought if he would create this new modern Hebrew, literary style, it would be great. And which, maybe it was, maybe it wasn't, but these days nobody, people, it's very hard to understand what he was saying. But this was actually written in Europe, so it's actually in fairly understandable Hebrew. And I just want to, and again, it's controversial, but I think, again, in terms of the question beforehand, I think he saw the fact that he saw people who were really, who had reached the conclusion that the ideas of evolution must be true, and the views of the Bible critics must be true, and what do we do? And no one was doing anything. So this is what he says. He says, and this is in Parakeh, he says, Va'afilu im nifaresh od yoter al pi mashal. He starts off in the beginning, he talks about how the Rambam said that a lot of the creation story was a mashal. We mentioned that before, the Abarbanel said that. He says, let's push it. Let's say, even if we say that it's a mashal, when it talks about the creation of man, and that he was put into Gan Eden, and the fact that he named the animals, and the fact that woman was created from him. Ein davar misnaged liyesodei haTorah. Nothing about this would be going against the Torah. Right? And he said, and he talks about, again, if we read this whole thing as a marshal for the creation of man, he said this would not be a problem. He says, again, it is essentially, if you're stuck and you're reading these ideas and you say to yourself, this is impossible, man could not have been created in this way, 5,700 years ago, or whatever it is, and you want to read it as a mashal. And again, he's not necessarily saying that he did this. Rav Kook was a very frum man. I want to make that very clear. But he says, but if you want to read it this way, there is absolutely nothing wrong with doing this. He continues on the next page, and he starts talking about the Nachash, and he actually points out that there was a little bit of a footnote. He wrote this on the side. He actually says, "Ve'ein kpeda im netzayer hanachash kulei tziyuri." If you imagine, again, he said it's not a problem if you say that Brias Olam is written about in a way that's a mashal, that it's not a literal story. And he already said it's not a problem if you say the creation of Adam and Chava, putting them into Gan Eden, and the creation of Chava, the naming of the animals. And now he goes so far as to say, "Ve'ein kpeda im netzayer hanachash kulo tziyuri." Even if you say the Nachash, the whole story with the Nachash also was completely just a story, again, was a mashal, there is absolutely nothing wrong with that. V'chein ha'etz hadas. And again, and then he goes through and he says, what could this story mean? But he says, if you're stuck with that, again, as long as you hold on to the idea that this comes from God, that you're not going against the Torah. In other words, the deal breaker, the thing which you must believe as a believing Jew is that the Torah comes from God, but you're not obligated to believe that God can only tell us things in the way of a true story. You can say it even if it was in form of a mashal. And here I'm just gonna finish off one last part. He says at the end of the parak, Klalan shal davar. He says, even though everything that the scientists and the philosophers say, it hasn't been proven yet. So in other words, it's possible, maybe they'll be wrong. But he says, but even if they're right, but he says, but since the generation believes it and sees it as being true, these ideas, both from philosophy and science, are starting to cause our young people to lose their emunah. ובאים בימים הדומים להם ברפיון כוח, הבינה וההכרה הישרה, and they're starting to lose like the ability to like basically trust the Torah. Al kain aleinu achova levaer. Therefore, we have an obligation to explain she'im yiyu gam kain kol ela chakiros umtos. Even if all these theories, these scientific and philosophical theories, will be true, enan nogos meuma liyasodos haTorah v'sifa. It will not affect the Torah one bit. Okay, and again, I'm not taking a position here. I'm not telling you that you have to believe what Rav Kook says. But again, at the beginning, I told you a little bit about questioning. And I think that, again, that sometimes we run up against this point, and I know that there was a point in my life when I ran up against this myself, where you start to have questions and you start to feel like, if I believe X, I've walked out, I'm no longer a mammon. And what Rav Kook, does here, is gives you permission, again, to, again, he's not saying you should believe everything that philosophy says, and you don't have to believe everything that science does. But if you're really, really convinced, and you can't go on with taking these things literally, if you want to say that this was a mashal that, and again, how far can you push that? That's, again, once we start getting later on in the Torah, then it becomes a lot more difficult. But certainly towards the beginning of Bereshis, he was asked, how far does this go? There was a letter. He was asked, how far does this go? And he says, the Jewish people will decide. In other words, certainly for the beginning of Sefer Bereshis, and he certainly seems to imply, certainly Parshas Bereshis, maybe even afterwards, if a person says this isn't literal, they are still a mammon. They're still, yeah. So no, I understand.
I don't think that it's a contradiction.
Right. So that's the thing. It's the Yigimali Karam are, I don't want to get, I don't want to be, too controversial in saying this, but I think, there's different approaches to the, the Rambam wrote various Svarim, and they don't all go together so seamlessly well. And there's big question is, how do we deal with the Rambam? And the approach I prefer, and it's certainly not the only approach, and it's certainly not the Frumis approach, is that he wrote his different books for different audiences. In other words, right.
He wrote like more Devuchan for, for one type.
Right, and if you read the Moreh Nevuchim, what he says in there doesn't exactly line up even with what he says by the Yud Gimel Ikarim. I don't want to get too much into that. It was, but a lot of it was very much tied into his particular approach to Greek philosophy.
The Yud Gimel Ikarim don't say that the Torah is, you have to believe everything literally.
Right.
The whole Torah is true.
Right.
The Torah will never be changed. But it doesn't say
right, but it's still, but still, again.
You said there was some basics that you have to believe in order to.
Right. Yeah, right. That's the thing. In other words, it has to believe that the Torah comes from God. But in other words, but the particular message in terms of right. In other words, I don't. And the Abarbanel himself said that the Rambam certainly took the beginning of Bereshis as not literal. Again, he doesn't specify so far. So I just want to wrap up with kind of a basic question. Yeah. That's what I'm saying. You get a lot of room. That's what I'm saying. I tell people. One of the things I tell people is that there's two different things. There's what you can say publicly, and there's what you can believe. In other words, there's certain things as a community we've accepted certain approaches and not others. And if you're going to get up and you're going to go against those, as people discover all the time these days, if you're going to say publicly something that goes against that, you're going to end up with a fight. But in terms of your own person, right. Right. But in terms of your own beliefs, in other words, that's the thing. Like, in other words, there are certain things that the Ralbag said, that the Rambam said, that Rav Kook said, that if you said it publicly, your kid would probably be kicked out of yeshiva, and you would no longer be welcome in shul. So again, but the Rambam, right. No, but I'm saying, but that's the thing. The Rambam also, if you read the introduction to the Moreh Nevuchim, the Rambam says something very interesting. He says, I'm going to write things in here that are going to seem to contradict, and I'm not going to tell you how to work it out. And there is a real answer. And what I believe is somewhere in here, basically good luck, figure it out for yourself. And again, I think what he was basically taking this approach. A friend of mine in Israel said this to me. He's basically taking this approach.
Could understand the way they need to.
Right, saying everyone could, and you know what, and therefore, right, in other words, you're never going to pin me down on saying something that you're going to say is problematic, because you'll say, oh, how could you say that? Oh, maybe that's one of the things I didn't mean. The Rambam understood that, again, he was living in a world where most people were not philosophers, most people couldn't handle this, and he said, you know what, I'm not going to make clear what I believe. So I think that's really, I think where we're at. In other words, if you want to be part of a community that has certain beliefs, as much as it might sometimes be difficult, you have to know when to keep your mouth shut. You don't need to, I use social media a lot more than I should. I blog, but not everyone has to know everything you believe. But I'm saying, but in terms of your own beliefs, if you're stuck on something and you say, how could this be? I can't believe X. But then you find out Rav Kook spoke about it. Found out the Ralbag spoke about it, the Rambam. In terms of your own personal beliefs, again, you have a very, very wide range. I mean, it's really, you have to really, really push it to really be out. I mean, it's not a simple thing to be a non-believer. It takes a lot of work. It's certainly, right. And I'm saying, but there's so many, that's the thing. I mean, I'm even if there's some things you can't say from the Ralbag publicly, I'm not willing to say that, it was okay for him to say it, but it's clearer now. I mean, either, I think the Ralbag got into Olam Haba, and I think if he did, I'm willing to go with him. Now, again, right, I might not say it publicly, but I think you could say it. So I think, so just to finish off, my question is, does it matter? Does it matter whether we take the story literally? Does it make a difference whether there was actually a walking, talking snake? So on some level, the answer is not at all, right? I mean, who cares? Right? In other words, as Rav Hirsch would tell you, and I mean, I think it is ultimately, again, the Torah is not a history book. It doesn't really make a difference. It might be interesting, but ultimately it doesn't make a difference as long as we take the Torah from Hashem. But I think, on the other hand, I think it really does matter, because I think what we've seen tonight, starting with Rav Sadigon and going all the way through, Rav Kook, and the truth is, I think you could probably go even further back into the time of the rabbis of the Mishnah and the Gemara. Logic is legit. Being logical, asking rational questions and saying, wait a second, I don't understand, how can X be, is a perfectly legitimate thing to do. And I think it's an important thing that we have to know for ourselves, and I think it's a very important thing to know for our children. We might have to tell our children that certain questions, you should bring home and tell, you should tell mommy and tati rather than saying it in school, because, it's not going to go well for you. But I think it's very important that our kids not be given this message that if you ask questions, you're a non-believer. I mean, what's Gemara if not, series after question after question after question, Jewish philosophy from Rav Sadigon and the Ibn Ezra and the Rambam and the Barbanel and Rav Shmuel Hirsch, Rav Kook, all the way to today, it is, questions are legit, questions are appropriate, and they should be asked. And it's okay to say, I don't understand how this works. It's also sometimes okay to say, like, I don't know, but again, I think it's such an important thing. Yeah, right. I think, but I think it's such an important thing. I mean, unfortunately, our children many times in school are given this message that, that's, how could you ask such a question? And that's a terrible thing. I mean, it's learning. It represents a lack in the teacher. Right. Yeah, it is. Look, I think unfortunately, I think a lot of teachers and, have not been trained in these things. I think a lot of them, if you ask them to discuss these things, I don't think that they've learned these books. And again, I have to wonder what, that's part of what Rav Kook, I think, was talking about. I mean, he talks about the dangers of a Gemara-only education. I mean, I said to my daughter the other day, I said, thank God the girls get to learn Tanakh and you get to learn, Hashkafa and things like that. I mean, the boys, you learn Gemara only. I mean, you're not going to know these things. The other reason why I think it's important is that to know that Torah and science don't conflict. There are all these, ideas about what do we do when Torah and science conflict? Rav Sadigon and the Rambam say that by definition that cannot be. It is impossible for something to be true scientifically to go against the Torah, because again, as it says, Roa Echad Lekulam, the same God who created the world with all the rules of science is the same God who gave us the Torah, and therefore they have to go together. And our challenge, and again, we don't have to do it on our own. I mean, it's what our Chachamim did. When there seems to be a conflict, we have to figure out, okay, how are we going to creatively read the Torah in a way that is still honest to the Torah, but that again, that without saying that, science is a problem. And I think that this is just, again, I just think, and questioning and all these things, I think that it's such an important thing. As I said before, I don't want to introduce questions. I don't believe, I don't believe in telling people questions that they should have. And there's nothing wrong with not questioning. I always have, I think, what they call Pashat Amunah, I think it's a beautiful thing. It's a wonderful thing. There's a time in my life where I think I had it. But I think that at least for some of us, sometimes we lose that. Or maybe we never have that. I mean, it's to a certain degree, it's a gift to just be able to say, you know what, I don't understand. I don't need to understand. I trust Hashem. I trust Hashem's Torah. Chas v'shalom, I don't want to tell you that the only, Jewish approach is to ask questions. I think that there's something, I honestly, there are times where I'm tremendously jealous of, of people who have this Pashat Amunah, who don't struggle with these things. But the other side of it that I just want to make clear is that again, if you do, it's okay. It's appropriate that questions are good. They're not always going to get an answer. It might take you a very, very long time. I mean, and that's okay also. But again, when we talk about reading Torah rationally, the big thing is just again is that you don't need to shut off your mind. Chas v'shalom, when you learn Torah, that the very act of Torah is supposed to be an act involving your intellect and not just your neshama, and it's a positive thing. And again, I think that really. You open up a Mikros Gedolos, open up the books of the Achronim. They've really shown us the way to read Torah rationally. And for those of us who are interested in that, and for those of us who have a need, it's not only, we're not only able to do that, but we should do that. And we shouldn't be afraid to question. We shouldn't be afraid to struggle. Questions are actually how we grow, how we develop. I mean, sort of as the Shadal said beforehand, just like we wouldn't, I said, sometimes I'm jealous of people who, don't have questions, and sometimes it can be very frustrating and questions can be painful. In the end of the day, I'm not sure I'd go back. In the end of the day, the struggles I had, and I don't make light of it. I mean, there was a 2-year period in my life where I was not, where I was really scared. I stopped teaching. I wasn't sure, that I could be in a classroom anymore. It was very, very painful. But at the same time, when I look at who I've become and through the struggle and the people I've met and all the Torah that I've learned that I never would have without it. And, so again, it's not, you can't put the rabbit back in the hat, so to speak. You can't, if you've lost that Pashat Emunah, I'm not, I'd be lying to you if I told you that I know how to get you back to it. But what I will tell you is that, that there is a way to stay with that, to be someone who's rational and critical and thinks about things and challenges and asks questions. And it doesn't mean chas v'shalom that you're disconnected from Torah or Hashem.
I think also to add something that you said before about like the boundary being believing that the Torah is from Hashem.
Right.
That's really the foundation. That's really, in my humble opinion, just if you have a strong enough foundation and emunah, and maybe it'll be based on facts and things that you need to see and understand. No, it's not necessarily just come inherently. But once you have that, then everything else, if you don't really understand the talking snake, that's okay. You know what I mean?
Right. Right. So that's the thing. It's right. It's basically, you asked before, like, what are the lines? God, and involvement in the world, God giving the Torah. Pretty much beyond that, there's almost anything past that, there's a lot of different approaches.
And I think our yeshivas are starting to understand that. I was telling my husband, like, Shabali to the yeshivas, and I'm jealous of that because I wish I would have had that experience. They start from the ground up, and for a lot of us, I think when you go to yeshiva, you go right into what Rashi says and Chumash, and you're like, okay, Hashem said this. Well, who's Hashem? What's Hashem? How do I know? That none of that gets taught to you, and it's
right. And look, even the fact that again, like
Rashi.
Right. Well, no, but even there's more than that. Like Chumash and Rashi is sort of. I remember someone wrote recently. I saw, she said that someone in her class once said, where Rashi brings down and says, when it says a new king came over Egypt, and Rashi says some say he was a new king and some say he acted like a new king, and she said, what, Rashi didn't know the answer, and the teacher said, oh, you're being chutzpahdik. But like sometimes we're taught, that Chumash and Rashi, that's it. That what Rashi says is from Har Sinai, that a question, whatever it is. And again, like that's the thing. If you look the Ramban, anyone who comes after Rashi, but in terms of Chumash, in terms of halacha, they beat Rashi up. It's just they weren't afraid. In other words,
they had that solid emunah.
Right. That's the thing. As long as if
you can question anything, you can ask.
Right. No, that's what I've really found in my own life is that as long as I feel I have this solid relation with Hashem and that I feel Torah is my connection to God, any question that can be dealt with. Yeah.
I just want to mention to you that I feel that I'm always interested in science. Reconciling Hitler and seeing Clarksville speaks a lot about it in very real terms.
Right. So I don't know him personally. I know we're working on bringing is Slifkin coming in the end? Or
right. So Nazan Slifkin, who's written a lot about this, so he's going to be speaking in August about science and Torah. So,
right.
Everybody wants to just see these written things and talk.
Yeah. Look, again, there are a lot of different approaches.
The other thing is that I wanted to say this is Hasidus esoteric stuff considered rational and very much not. Super rational.
Well, the interesting thing is that, like, as I was saying today, like, there are a lot of people who are trying to deal with a lot of these kind of questions about all these historical things. And sort of like late 19th century, early 20th century, Rav Kook is part of this, but Ishbitz and Rav Tzadok, they're not so hung up on this stuff. And some of the stuff they say, again, like, in terms of hashkafically is pretty, they give you some interesting room. Again, I mean, there's some people who kind of want to, if you read some of these things, it's sort of, they weren't so much hung up on this. They were much more into this idea that the main thing is relationship with Hashem, like sitting there. I mean, like that's thing. I think
I relate totally to esoteric.
Well, but I don't see it as being a stira. I mean, that's, I mean, Rav Kook very much combined all of that. I mean, I think that in many ways, I think they would just tell you, like, I mean, if you're asking that question, in Chassidus, I think that question would just be like almost laughed at. Like, I mean, like the question of whether it was a real, I mean, there's a very beautiful idea from Ishbitz. I haven't seen it inside yet. I'm still have to get myself a Meishloch, but he says, he says, why does it say Anochi Hashem Elokecha, not Ani Hashem Elokecha? He says the letters of Anochi is Ke Ani. He says, never ever think that you know God. You have Ke Ani. You as a human being, we're always struggling with that, right? And he says, Elohei Masecha Lo Sa'as Elecha. Never make God into a into something. I know what God is. That's what Cook says. He says, if you think God is unknowable, if you think you know who God is, that's basically heresy. So I'm saying, and so that's why I think Chassidus gives us the sense of like, okay, I don't know how it works out, but it doesn't really matter. In other words, I have Hashem, I have this relationship with Hashem, I have God's Torah. Everything else either doesn't matter or is you might want to ask, but in other words, but I think that's almost like along the lines of what Rav Hirsch is saying.
Basically, if God, this makes a lot of sense to me, and
right.
This would make sense to other people. But if I understood God, then He should serve me.
Right.
Why do I serve Him? Obviously, I serve Him because if I understood Him, I wouldn't be serving Him. He's beyond my knowledge. Right.
Well, that's what the Rambam says. Rambam says, he says, "Ilu yadativ hayativ." If I knew who God was, I'd be God. Right? And that's it's an important thing just to keep in mind that I think we. Right. The truth is that I mean that's the thing. I'm very into rationalism. I love reading all these books, and I love Chassidus, and I don't think they conflict at all.
I think that I think by Tefillin you say V'yidata Hashem Be'ersichim Le'olam, right? It's by Tefillin,
yeah.
Right. I think the point is that you have to know that there's a God, and I don't think that it has to be pointed out with a label.
Right. No, that's what I'm saying. I mean,
once it's labeled, it's already. If you label it, I think it goes into like a Mudazara because you're.
Yeah, no, I mean, look, but definitionally, that's saying definitionally, God is outside of being able to be proven or disproven. In other words, I mean, science can prove or disprove things, or try to at least, in terms of experimenting in terms of physical objects. God is outside of that, so it's off the table. In other words, it comes down to it comes down to Amunah, it comes down to this relationship. But if you have that and you have the connection to God through Torah, the details, we can talk about, and we can, I mean, there's a lot of room to question, and
I think philosophy kind of helps you understand the idea of God, and Chassidus helps you live it.
Again, it depends. It depends on the person. In other words, that's the thing. I would never. I mean, I think again, one of the issues I think also with Jewish education is that we kind of give I think it was Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky talked about the Sodom bed. Like one size fits all, and it's sort of I mean, one size almost never fits anyone. It's there's again that's the thing. There are certain people who have these kind of questions and whatever it is, and I think it's very important that they be given a sense. And again, but people who don't have philosophy or I mean, when I've taught in other schools. Remember, there were certain times where kids would learn philosophy and they'd come out with questions they never had before, and they ended up struggling with their emunah. So I think it's very, very important. I think people who don't have the questions, there's no mitzvah to confuse people. There's no mitzvah to study things that are going to make you uncomfortable. But for people who have these questions, Baruch Hashem, we're not on our own. I mean, Lo Alman Yisrael, Jewish people, have had a lot of great thinkers who have who have given us the ability to deal with all these struggles. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.